later, but so let me just share the screen here again. This desktop, yes. So this is the Obsidian file, right? I was just looking at the list here and just kind of contemplating it with the presentation, and I'm just going to walk through some things that I'm not clear if they are in the Obsidian. Monica, let me know if you think they're already there or if it's something we should include, because like I think everything, like the idea of input, output, Trinitarianism is there. The idea of environment, affordances, niches, it's all there. Fixation and experience, figuration and mapping. The material basis is there.
Yeah, but this is not covered. That how it is linked. That it can be. It can come. The black box can come in three types.
For example, that
like
could
the
be
black box of our own system and the black box of the.
I wonder how we could name this, because that's I think this is already a moment where having a glossary comes in handy, because if we wanted to talk about that, right, the fact that once you are a system, there are three types of unknowns. I wonder how we could call that to begin with. So we could then add it to the glossary, this type of, because it's something I wasn't very clear. You can even see it because the type of example that I gave, which was I couldn't find like a nice image, and I just gave kind of a kind of textual example, because I feel like this is a good idea, because it's true, once you are like you take an organization's point of view, there's all the things that you need to do, you need to respect, that you need to push as a system, but there's all the things you rely on that you can't really name, because they are, or you can only name them from afar. They're kind of black boxes. And I thought that like S2P, for example, relies on technical things and even relies on aspects of everyone's lives in terms of work. People having free time is something we depend on, but we can't really directly influence people's jobs. So it's kind of a black box that we depend on. It's a bit of the material basis of our collective. But there is also the black box of, for example, this is a second type, right? The fact that when we are discussing things like promoting our work, and we're discussing actions that go outward, like organizing a conference, writing a book, it's all actions we do to the outside, but that brings a different type of thing that we can't really open up, which is how do people respond when we promote our work, or how are people reading it, or what the effects that this action is going to have. That's also a type of situated or relative black box, right? It's a black box about what is the outside, what is our environment. And then there is a third type, which is when you get an input coming from the other. So say people tell us that they are finding very hard to understand what we do. So the environment responded. There's still the question, is it responding that way because like it's social constraints, people don't want to engage, they're conservative, we're not doing things right, or because there is a more fundamental restriction? That's a third type of black box, right? Which is we do get a response, but we can't tell apart if the response is coming from logical constraints that are part of the world, or coming from something even deeper, which is further restrictions. Like an example of this for me is when political movements press the government, and the government says we can't do anything because we don't have the money. Well, don't they have the money because it's true they don't have the resources, or is it political? They don't want to give the resources, right? Or something like that. That's an ambiguity about the nature of that input, right? So these three things seem to have to do with how this black box exists for the environmental logic. But I don't have a good name, a good idea for a name of the thing that is the similar thing in all these cases, right? Because it's not just the relation between material basis and logic. It's the relation between material basis and the environment dynamics, right? So it's a slightly different thing from just the environment or just the material basis. So it would be good to have a name for this type of kind of perhaps material limits for environments, right? Rather than basis, because it's always like an unknown, right? Always a limit to something. I don't know. Do you guys think that's a good name?
Yeah, I like it.
Dennis, do you think it's okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Just I'm following, because I mean, I follow your examples, but I was just thinking, like, so you have
I did some. Oh fuck! I need to reopen. But yeah,
you have constraints. You have your constraints, so that's STP's constraints. You have constraints coming from the outside from another system. And then you have the constraints of that other system, right? So I mean, just thinking of it in terms of constraints rather than the material basis, that is the source of the constraints.
yeah. I think the whole issue is that there are two types of sources of constraints, right? So, for example, when we say STP is not gonna charge money for its videos. We're not gonna charge. That constraint, it's not a black box. We could open that constraint because it's itself part of what we do. We're a communist collective. We chose not to be a profit enterprise or something, right?
Yeah,
but
self-imposed constraints.
Yeah, it's part of the political or social form.
Right.
It is decomposable inside of the world of that system. Right? We can analyze that constraint. We can split it into smaller constraints. And those smaller constraints are also part of our decisions, right? Whereas, so it's self-imposed, but it's not necessarily just because it's self-imposed. It's just that even if we were to analyze them further into parts or change them a bit and so on, or have to respond to changes in the political world, those things are, let's say, part of what we do. Whereas everyone's work conditions, that's beyond the scope of things we can interact with, right? So it's kind of a black box to us. It's still a constraint. Like, can we, like, if we want to be very exaggerated to show the difference, right? Do we sell our videos? No. Okay, that's a type of constraint. Can we produce a book a week? No, but that's a different type of constraint that has to do with like having time or even it being humanly capable, possible to do. That's a constraint that is, we can't open up that constraint and tweak it and change it and get some other result.
Yeah. Okay. So the difference is it has to be beyond our reach. For it to be a material constraint, it needs to be beyond the reach of what we're able to interact with.
Yeah, unless you change the world, right? Unless you change the context, right? So, for example, we might be able to, with a technical example, for example, we might be able to change the softwares we use, but the discourse about software implementation, that's not STP's world. That's like engineering, tech, and the decisions and what's relevant to get that done is not the same as what's relevant for STP. For example, usually you get like a communist organization. It's a system. It's like it has its own logic and so on. And then when it comes to the time of like, okay, we need to shift to another software, or we need to develop a software, suddenly the communist collective is buying somebody's service to do it, because you can't get to that transformation inside your own logic. If you want to mess with that black box, you need to change the context, right? I think that the whole idea of material basis is to get to a point of what we like what in Lacan is like the real, the impasse of formalization, but to give it a relative definition, right? It's a impasse relative to some form. If you change the form, it might not be an impasse. So for an egalitarian political group, some of its logistics is a black box. It's the point of real for that group. Well, but if you suspend the commitment with egalitarianism, well, we can't pay somebody to just change the logistics, right? But then you need to abdicate from the logic that you were following. So it's a real relative to a form. Right? That was the idea with the example of the car. Like a car is a commodity. It's between production and circulation. Even the car parts are commodities because they themselves can be caught up between production and circulation. But if you go to the car engine and ask how it works, suddenly you need to stop talking about input of commodities and output of commodities and start talking about air fuel mixtures coming in and exhaust gases coming out. So you need to change the context of what counts and what doesn't count, right? So in a certain sense, the engine logic is a real to commodity production. It's there, you rely on it, but you can't fully explain it away just in terms of price. Like the price of gasoline doesn't explain how an engine works. You can say, why does this engine work the way it does? Well, to some point, you can even say, yeah, it does work this way because it's cheaper to work this way. It's very polluting because it's cheaper. But still, why does it need, a combustion chamber and to create this pressure with the spark plug? That's a different logic. That's a different context that explains it, right? And then there are things which are the real for that context. For example, the way that a carbon molecule is structured doesn't really interest the engineer exactly at this level of description. And to go into this level, you need to change the world again and go into the world of physics, right? Where usefulness and optimizing kind of combustion rates is not relevant. So the whole idea of the material basis is to think about something which is undecomposable, inaccessible from the standpoint of a certain form. Right? And you do see this exact logic in these three ways. Right? It could even be perhaps the logic of the real, because it's now the logic of a limit for a point of view, right? Not just in general.
Yeah, exactly. It's everything that is other to the form that the form still depends on. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe this is the logic of the real, right? And it's very Lacanian because there are three ways that the real appears. The real as cause of desire, the real of the other as like, what do you want? And the barred other.
Wow, it's like you planned it.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool now that I think of it. I should have added that to the presentation. That's much better than my example. Yeah, I vote we call it just real. Just like or logic of the real, or relative real, or something like this. By the way, how do I add a new entry? Is it with this note?
Yeah, yeah, that's it.
Perhaps something like this. What do you guys think? Like, system. Um, sure.
It's gonna help us so much with writing the book too.
Yeah,
Like we
I
can just put this in the appendix. Or use this in the appendix.
I just saw somebody send a message here. Okay. Yeah, just added a bunch of stuff. We can make it better later. Just add an example at some point, and also relates to Lacan's concepts of cause of desire. Um, Simple stuff. I love that to have an entry that just says real. Yeah, but it's a good example of something that just having the glossary already helps, not only because then you need to name the thing with clarity, and it's already like a new thing we didn't have before. I was just thinking, like, I was seeing here we have environment. I wonder if we should have composition of environments inside of environment, or as a separate, perhaps as a separate thing, right?
Yeah, because it's actually the different thing, right? The ecologics.
Yeah. You put here. Yeah, we don't have ecologics. I'll just add it like that. See if I, um, see if I can. I tried to add a bunch of examples here. Probably I could add those words like uh, I think this will also lead us to something I was very confused. Sorry, reconfirm. Because I think I didn't present well enough in the presentation, which is, where is it? Yeah, here. First of all, I think that maybe this part here about this, we can just add when we define environments, we can just say social environments have 3 logics, right?
Mhm.
Just put it here.
And
Also,
should we add a link?
yeah, we probably should add links to these things, right? So
Yeah, you highlight it and right click on it.
okay, add link.
Mhm. Yeah.
It found already the thing?
Mhm.
Holy crap. Oh my God, this is amazing. Then what did I add? Like the ecologics thing, composition, I think is a link.
Yeah.
Environment.
That's amazing. Here, just
Yeah,
make sure.
you can highlight the logics and link it to social logics or
Okay.
uh,
I can just substitute. Where? How do I
you have to type it probably.
type? No. Yeah,
You
just
should be-
you just see if I can.
Because we don't have an entry for social logics yet, right?
No, I think
Yeah.
we do social logic.
Oh, okay. Oh, it just didn't detect.
I might just change it there to make it easy, right? Multiple social. It found it.
Yeah, you can write the entry, then there's a vertical slash and then the word you want to have in the text.
I also remove.
If you wanted to make it more readable and still link it.
Let's see if
Like
we might find now. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you, what Monica was saying is you can also rename it, the word there, but still have it link by putting a vertical bar before it, right?
Like this? No. A vertical.
Yeah, complete vertical, like, yeah, and then write the like logics there before.
This one,
Before.
because it did found social logics here.
yeah, you
Oh
you
my God, I'm
created.
a moron. Okay, let me do it. Guys, I must be making you very nervous with my multiple social logics. I'm just gonna add it here, and then you're saying is that I do like this, add link, and then what do I do to link it to the type?
The vertical bar.
Just right after the first brackets, just write social logic and then make a vertical bar. Yeah, yeah, after the double brackets.
So after the double bracket, right? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
You think this is gonna work?
No.
Maybe
Um,
it's the inverse, right? But this is the display and this is the actual logic,
yeah,
right?
the first is the link and the second is what is
Oh my
displayed.
God, finally. Sorry, guys. Sorry. Mode C. I think we don't have mode A yet here. I know we do. Let me see if I learned it
Yeah.
correctly. Now I put the bar after.
Yeah. You can make aliases, I think, in Obsidian, so that the different words leads to a link. But
I see. Yeah, but I think it worked. I just wrote the wrong word, but environment. Yeah, so anyway, it covers this. Perhaps we could distinguish between public and vulgar space.
Mhm.
In aligned social spaces. Probably this should be environments. We need to add a difference between aligned and misaligned as well, so we can link it here. Affordances. Uh, I'll just add the line so we can quote it later. And this, so I'll just add here social atoms where the three social logics reinforce each other so that simple definition of this, so that what makes a difference for one layer also highlights what makes a difference for another. For example, in a welfare, modern welfare European state, to be to abide by the law, to be a good family member, and to be a productive worker tend to converge so that respect. The first constraint is this respect. Okay, here we go again. Let me see if I learned it properly. social logic. That's so. Something like this. And then just use this to.
Yeah, here was thinking about how does the atom play into this, the social atom? Because we're saying this is a space, so isn't it, so it's
Yeah, I don't like that. I think,
where there's many atoms.
yeah, our examples usually are, we define this at the atomic level, right? So it shouldn't be space, it should be something before that, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, in the case of the modern, European state, that does seem like it's much bigger than just an atom.
Yeah, actually, I think a good example of this is to say something more similar, like the juridical form is well adapted to represent family matters, and both of these are conducive of the value forms propagation. So that's more at the very basic level, right?
Yeah, I see.
I think we also need vertical integration. Remember, this idea that you're not looking at things this way, you're looking at if the layers are how they're stacked, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, you can define at this level, like how you parse out what counts and what doesn't count in juridical terms, like hereditarity, property, responsibility, ownership, all those things. Families are structured in a way to deal well with those categories. So you have heirs, you have things you pass along to your family. Marriages are legal and they are trying to respect legality and actually be defined legally above everything. And all of those things are also conducive to property rights, which are conducive to value form, right? So these things are stacked vertically in a harmonious way, right? Converging way. So I agree. I don't think it should be defined on too big of terms because it's meant to be, it can be at least aligned at a very kind of fine-grained level, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like there's probably connections from this idea to niches on one hand, and also the definition of material again.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
If we just
Because
do
an
the same
aligned
thing here.
space, the niches should look different in aligned spaces versus misaligned.
Yeah, I
Is it
think
like saying in an aligned space, there's just one niche? Or and in a misaligned space that you actually have to go to different places to get different kinds of affordances. Let's
yeah,
say.
exactly. I mean, this is the basis for distinguishing what we call the public space. Isn't the public space like the biggest institution of the aligned? Like every institution in an aligned space is like a part of the public space, right? So I went to the public, like a department of this and that. What is it there for? To care for the public and so on. I went to this other department. It's also concerned with public safety, public this, public that. It's as if the niches are all talking, right, about the same thing. When you're in a misaligned space, you go to talk to I don't know, the car, I don't know how you call this, like the public department that deals with license for cars, and it's like a mafia. It only cares for its own stuff. And then you go to the schools, and the schools are a mafia themselves. And then you go Like there is no public space. Everyone is trying to bring the niches are more diverse. They don't afford you the same thing, and they're actually kind of struggling over who gets to colonize the so-called public thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there, from that description you just gave, we could then connect that to the entry about the overlapping and non-overlapping environments, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why in the presentation this came after the composition.
Mhm.
Because if you have a social environment, which implies that it has the three logics in it, if those three logics, like here, right? If you have aligned versus misaligned, in the aligned, the more these environments are connected, the more they create a conjuncted environment that's reinforcing that integration, right? So institutions facilitate connection, and shared environments constrains the systems because you get this, let's say, the constraint of the environments of their affordances are multiplied the more you compose it together, right? That's why the arrows here are inverted. When the environments, when they are composed, they don't overlap. The affordances are all different. You don't get like these big institutions, big niches that you can trust. It's actually the systems that are kind of competing for that environment, as if you want to make sure your affordance, that what you need is what matters in that shared environment. It's not common, right? For example, in Brazil, we're getting this very much now, and I think in many places in the world this is happening, where there is no agreement that universities are public institutions in any sense, even if they're private. They're not there for the public. So some people claim they are very important. Other people say they're elitist niches meant to reproduce just a part of the society. So there's no agreement that they share universities as their environment. Only some people can go there. Even those who go there become very distinct from the rest. So there is like a fight over the environment rather than a convergence in that common thing, right? Just going to give an example that relates to very peripheral social spaces, often productive, often to value form propagates itself outside of the reach of legality, so that we see a divergence between value logic and property logic, exemplified in the form of, let's say, militias who run productive activities such as drug trafficking and even basic social security trees. Is it not how it's written? I have a friend who just wrote a book about this fact that, for example, in Brazil, you see that what he calls the militia form substitutes the juridical form in places where capital still works, but you don't get the state ruling. Like you need a different type of violence and monopoly of violence ruling over what goes on there. But it's still just regular work, you know? So all of this was to be able to go back to that public space and actually say in aligned and say we actually know what this means, right? Aligned forms And now I know how to do this in aligned social environments. We could use, Dennis, you suggested we add something about the niche here, right?
Yeah, something about the structure of the niche.
Yeah, when the composition of social environments can count on an aligned vertical integration, it is easier to form shared niches. There is institutions that facilitate connections and that constrain many systems at once. I'm just going to add here vertical integration. All right, perhaps smaller. Okay. Vertical integration concerns the way different social logics are either converging or diverging in how they shape what matters and what doesn't for a given part of the social world. It is the social atoms can be aligned or misaligned in their way the social logics are stacked at a given point. Does this make sense, guys? What do you think?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll just add now the vulgar space. We should have most of what we need. And misaligned social environments. How fuck I need to copy this? Affordances in one layer can conflict with affordances on another. So overlapping incongruent environments in capital society, we call this corrupted and heterogeneous shared space where affordances cancel each other out of vulgar space. When composition also cannot count on an aligned vertical integration, it is harder to form shared niches and systems tend to fight over the shared environment in order to guarantee that their relevant affordances are met. In this case, the shortest path to these affordances is often in the fragmentation of the composed environment. Kind of crazy how these things they do go together very well. So this brings us to the thing that I think it's not here, and is something that when I presented, I was Rafael raised a question, and I was a bit, I didn't like the answer that I gave him. I think it wasn't a good one, but I do think that it has a very, very profound effect on some of the early stuff we developed. Like when we first defined the organizational point of view, right? Our definition was like this. We had our diagram like this, right? You have all the arrows. And then we had org here. And we say org is this larger thing that is seeing all these things, right? But we always had a problem defining what this is, because it's, let's say, it's too broad. Like we know, like if this is just a statement, there are many ways of organizing. It's true. This is a statement that is bigger and refers to more things than all the ways affinity organizes, all the ways value organizes, all the ways that property organizes, and therefore it's bigger than the world. But it's very poor. It's not very determined. It's not like we have this big box of ways of doing things that we already know what's inside of it. Right? This is not kind of concrete, right? So one option that we had was to say, there is something here which is an instance of org, and that has a more concrete relation with these things, which is the actual political movements going around. Like the actual political movements, they are, for example, things like there is, something like, not that there is, but something like, I don't know, the Communist Party. Well, the Communist Party is irreducible to these three things. It's irreducible to the world, and it is more concrete than this point of view, which is so general, right? And there was even the proposition that we could call this arrow here the communist hypothesis, that there are concrete things that embody this abstract thing. But then it's a point of view of politics, of the political movement. This doesn't require the name of organizational point of view. So it always looked that this was a bit like, why, like, how do we justify adding this big thing here? So nothing wrong with it in itself, but it seems to me like there is this underlying issue. So when I started working on this environmental logic thing, the first thing I realized early in the work, right, this was something I did in the other presentation, when I did this thing here, that I realized that organizational Trinitarianism only acquires meaning, like clear meaning, after this transformation. When we're talking about systems and environments, it's very easy to talk about composition, intelligibility, and interaction. It's like this idea is more at home here. So I got to think, what if the organizational point of view is at home at this level? This is where it starts to make sense. And at this very general level, it's too general for it to make sense yet. So I was wondering while I was writing this, like, well, when Bogdanov, why did he find the organizational point of view when he invented the idea of environments? Because he was very much connected with that. Like, he's one of his big contributions that people are recognizing now is that unlike the guys who thought about systems theory and things like that, he always thought that systems have environments and that you can't really think about one thing without the other. And most of his concepts require the two things. And it was this, the context in which he came up with the idea of organization as the core category. So I was thinking if there wasn't a way of defining what is an organization, or what does this name relate to? When you talk about organizational point of view, seeing everything as organization, what does that, like, what are you seeing then? Right? Is that a way of defining this rather than taking it as an axiom? And I got this idea here, but I don't think it's fully developed because Rafael caught a very good question. My definition was this one here: to consider one system as also being the set of affordances of another system. That's the organizational point of view. So when I look at what I'm doing, not only from my own point of view, but I also imagine the point of view of another. You don't even need to imagine, but you just also see it from the point of view of another system of which you are the environment. That's when you start thinking organizationally. So the example that I gave, I think it's very bad, but it's very simple. Like, you're distributing pamphlets to people, they are your environment. But you are an organizer when, for example, you're writing things on the paper with the knowledge that you are in the environment of the people you're giving the paper to. And you need to take that into consideration when you write. If you just write the words you like, end capitalism, everyone is exploited, blah, 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 workers who are walking by and getting the paper, they're going to think you're a moron. Like, they don't want a paper that says that they are idiots, right? That type of thinking, where you need to think, what does my newspaper afford the workers who are receiving it? That's you placing yourself here rather than here. So there is a kind of, it's not a perspective shift because it didn't become the other system, right? You don't know necessarily what you afford to the other, but you're asking, like, you're interacting with the environment under that knowledge that you're not just using what it affords, but you're also affording other systems something. That seemed to me like something special about this particular distinction between systems and environments that allows us to ask about, how do you shift this point of view? And this shift is very much connected to the shift between means and ends, right? When we say don't treat the environment as a means to your own ideas, but also treat it as an end where you are the means to other people's ends, right? That also connects very well to organization because that's Kant's definition of organization. When he talks about intrinsic finality and, well, organisms are things which are both means and ends in themselves. It seemed to me like that's what's at stake, right? And organisms are very much this. They're constantly having to be both ends in themselves and means to other things, right? But Rafael raised this issue. He said, well, but what object exists that, like, would you have to change the system so that it can see itself in this way, right? So if organizational Trinitarianism claims that, well, the intelligibility of things depends on how they are composed, if you want to make yourself intelligible to another system, if you want to make yourself intelligible to yourself as but others are also using me. I'm not just using them. Wouldn't that entail a difference? Wouldn't there be a different type of organization to have an organization that has access to that quality or whatever? And I feel like that's not the right way to approach it. I don't think it's a matter of changing. You don't need to have systems seeing themselves as organizations to have an organizational approach to systems. But I do think I wasn't really, I didn't really nail it with that definition. So I mean, there's something about it that does seem to make sense to me. Like, a system is something that you fixated and you're warping everything based on the system's composition. And what is an organization? Is it a different thing than a system? No, it's the same thing, but you just overlap it twice. It's the system warping the environment, but it's the system itself insofar it was warped by some other system, right? Like this thing here, there is no change. This thing is exactly the same as this thing. But this here is like you warping everything, changing everything on account of what you afford. And this is you being changed by everything on account of what you afford to others. Those two things are happening at the same time. It's not like you don't need to change anything for this to be the case, right? But I was wondering if you guys think that there's something missing, if it's enough for a definition.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the difficulty for me on this is it feels very much like a perspective thing and not like a material constraint thing, right? Like saying, oh, okay, now I'm the affordances of some other system. What does that entail? Because I was thinking like, when one group says that they're in solidarity with another group, right? For example, you are in solidarity with Palestinians. That seems to fit your example, right? Like, in order to be in solidarity with someone else in their struggle, there is a spectrum of like effective to ineffective ways of doing that. And there's a lot of discussion, debate around what does it mean to be in solidarity. But I wonder if our definition can distinguish that a bit and say like there are forms of solidarity which are more organizational and others which are less organizational. Yeah, I guess I'm just what is the relationship between this thing you just defined and solidarity in general?
Yeah, I think you actually nailed the issue, because the first thing you said actually makes this perfect, because you said this is not a material entity, this is a perspective. Well, but we do want something which exists as the point of view and not as a thing, right?
Yeah.
So it makes sense. But then you added a question, which I think it's a perfect question, because if you do ask the question, what would something have to be to materially promote this point of view? And that raised you the issue of solidarity, because that has to do with acting on that principle of being an affordance to other systems, right? Well, if political groups are defined by being the case where you have a strong transformation where the material basis plays a part in the organization, and if the material basis is something that can appear both as inside of your system as part of the environment, then organizations that are tearing with their material basis are more prone to see themselves as the black box of new affordances to others than regular groups, right? So my point being, there might be a good argument to say that there is a convergence between becoming more political in the sense of engaging more and more with the common material basis that you and other systems share, and becoming that material entity that can see things organizationally. Right? I mean, solidarity has something to do with, even though we don't share anything obvious, you still might afford something through my existence, right? You're in Palestine, I'm here. I want to have solidarity means I want to afford you something, right? So it does look like the more an organization, the more a system is trapped or caught up in a very complex network of other systems and environments, and to navigate that, you need to compose many environments, you need to know how to deal with other systems' affordances, right? So the very process of building a political ecology is also the process of making your system more capable of seeing itself as the environment for others. So politicizing and acquiring the means to occupy the organizational point of view in a concrete way, they are kind of the same process.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So that kind of gives us a more zoomed in view of the thing you were talking about earlier with org and political movements, right?
Yeah, because then it becomes the exactly. Yeah, now that I think of it, it's almost the inverted thing. So you would say something like this. Like you have the world, and okay, let's say you have the three logics here, but that's actually going to be less important for us now. Say you have you're challenging the world here. You have some system here. It includes its material basis, which is how we were talking about being a political system, right? And it interacts with this world, which is part of its environment here, right? And then you have a different system here, which is also political. It's also interacting from a slightly different perspective. This other system is also interacting and tensioning with a different perspective. Well, if you now start trying to bind them together to create like a shared environment amongst them, right? They are gonna have to change and adapt in a way that makes them learn to be the environment of each other. For example, we're dealing with this in Rio right now. One of the movements we're close to, it's a solidarity kitchen. They offer free meals to homeless people. During the courier strikes, one problem that the couriers have is that if they go on strike, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of delivery boys. If they stop, other people just take their place. If they stop gaining money, and they live day by day. So one thing we're thinking of is there a way in which they can deliver the Solidarity Kitchen food during the strikes, and we can get militants, rather than to eat through apps or in restaurants, that they buy the food from the restaurant, from the Solidarity Kitchen. Like, that's a way of thinking about, that's clearly an organizing problem, right? And what that problem is dealing with is how to turn actions of a system, of the kitchen, into an affordance to another system, which is the delivery boy strike. So,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Right. So, but the moment that you start doing this, you're exercising exactly that capacity of seeing something as a system and as an environment, seeing something as a part of a system and as an affordance to another system, right? So the more you start doing this thing here, and you start increasing this, you are tending towards the org, right? This would be called a political movement, and it's expanding towards the pure organizational point of view, which you never get to, which would just see everything as affordances that connect with other affordances and blah, 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 right? So whatever this thing here is, it is, let's say, the concrete kind of structure that sees things organizationally. And you could say, yes, this is a pure theory. For example, S2P's theory wants to be here. because we want to be able to speak about all of these things and about their composition. And if some new thing would appear, we also want to be able to speak about it, right? To express it. So it is, let's say, an abstract, contentless version of this thing here. But you would be building it from the bottom up rather than defining it here and then trying to go down, right? Like,
yeah, and then also it fits.
this is increasing the POV, the org POV capacity, right?
Yeah, because in the other part where you were talking about figuration versus worldview, right? We could also say that I mean there would be no STP also without this real movement. So it's not like they're divided, they're two different things. One is abstract, one is concrete, but actually the abstract arises out of the concrete in a way.
Yeah, and I mean,
it's not just us.
Yeah, I think that's true, and also something else. I mean, now that I think of it, we shouldn't even put ourselves here. We should put ourselves here.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, and we share a bit of this environment with other groups, and we're just part of this thing. We're not outside of it, right? The theory exists in like video recordings, Monica's glossary. That's the material or existence of these things. They don't exist in the vacuum themselves. So even that is better placed inside of this space, right? And it can help to combine some things, but it's still a way of describing it without losing that focus, I think. And but then you get a nice kind of, you know, org almost becomes the arrow rather than the point, right? And I was thinking, like, my original idea was, well, if you get all the ways we perturbate the world, you do get that kind of configuration map, which is redescribe the world in terms of the ways you perturbed it, right? So rather than how a school appears normally, you will see how a school appears once you occupy the school, and the teachers look like policemen, or the parents become against the student. You learn a lot, right? So you get like a different view of the world from one side. So it's like you redescribe the world based on the experiments you do. That would be the arrows kind of outward, right? Redescribe the world. You can derive that from the perturbations, and there is so that's something we could feature somewhere in the diagram. And the other thing is, like, org now becomes more like this, right? This capacity that is increased, and the largest organizations which are connected with the most environments and that know how to afford to other political movements more stuff. Well, those are the concrete organizational eyes that we have, right? So it's a weight of no longer having something that is outside of the world, right? Or like outside of, with no materiality, which is the case with org, right? We don't know what it's made of. With all of this other stuff we're talking about, they all are made of something.
Yeah, I mean, and then I think this goes further to deal with another problem that was raised about org earlier, which is the question of conservative movements, right? It's not only political movements which want to enlarge the world, but also those that want to further, decrease novelty, or however you want to define, conservative or fascist movements.
Yeah.
And it seems like we have the means now to distinguish those two, because because org was just this abstract thing, you could kind of say any political movement is can adopt org. But here, because we're trying to address the largest possible set of environments, it seems like it is inherently non-conservative, right? It's inherently pushing the world outward rather than collapsing it in.
Yeah, this is something I didn't present on it, but I had this idea. Let me see where it is. Yeah, I didn't. My idea here was to do something. So you see these three things, right? These are a system transforming its own material basis. That transformation can also appear on the ways it interacts with the black box of the. So it's three ways to, let's say, do real change, which is perhaps an even better name than strong transformation now that we have a name for real, right? So real change can appear inside, can appear in interactions, and can appear, so it can appear at the level of composition, interaction, or intelligibility, right? What I didn't do that I was thinking of, which I think really works, is, so the definition of this strong transformation, and therefore of experiments, which would be inward compositional change, right? Intervention, which would be interactive change, and inquiry would be changes in intelligibility. What they have in common is that you take something which has no clear predicate, because it's undecomposable, and you force it, right? You're going to act different because you're now going to try to be composed in a way that includes something that is real. You're going to try to interact in a way that includes something that was real. You're going to try to inquire about the world in a way that considers something that is real. All of this has the structure of getting a system and adding its material basis in some level, right? And this leads to the need of expanding the world if you are to propagate this. But there is the inverse, which is when you have a system and you fixate a predicate. So it's like this. I actually already have it here somewhere in this crazy thing. Here. So imagine the inverse. Rather than expanding your system by using the material basis, you diminish your system and throw out a part of it that existed, right? So for example, you had a system, and rather than recompose it to add new stuff, you recompose it to make it smaller, like a purge. You say, from now on, only these people can join. And from now on, we only work on this way, right? So it's a subtraction of size. You had a system this size, and you want to just work with this and negate all of this. So this could be written like this, like a system constrained by this predicate, right? So that's a mutilation, which is an interesting way of inverting an experiment, right? An experiment is like this. This is my experience. I cannot see everything, so I will add something to it, like a prosthetic. Like my eyes can only see the stars from afar. I'm going to add a telescope, right? Or my behavior only goes so far. I'm going to change my behavior in some way. The idea is that you're getting the system and you're adding something. Here, you have a system and you're diminishing what it can do. You're restricting it. So this is like you're removing something. So in a certain sense, a mutilation is the contrary of an experiment. It's when you're saying, there is this capacity I'm no longer going to use, right? And I think it's very clear, for example, in the case of when you have an interaction, because an interaction, like you have a system and you have many ways you can do some outputs to the environment, and you remove some of them. You cannot act in some ways. That's kind of coercion, right? The contrary. So the contrary of experimentation would be like mutilation. The contrary of intervention which is like adding a new real capacity to your interaction, would be coercion, which is choosing some predicate and saying you can only act under these definable ways, right? And here I was reading a book about torture. That's why I added torture. But I think Inquisition is a good distinction from inquiry, because inquiry, you want to know something you didn't know. But Inquisition, historically speaking, is about obliging people to say what you already know, right? Which is how torture works in a way as well. You know exactly, you are going to shape the environment to make sure people can only say some predicate and not anything else. So there is a really cool way to define the difference between the three expanding terms of kind of political value, right? Experiment, intervention, and inquiry. And you could define them by ways of kind of reducing the world. And the funny thing is that they produce a black box. They make the black box bigger. If you say only things with certain predicates are valid, right? So, for example, previously it's like this. This is why it looks, this is an explanation of why the right looks like politics. Let's say you have a system, and this part here of the system we describe using the predicate P, and this part here we describe using the predicate Q. And there's still the fact that there is some material basis that goes unnamed, right? The reactionary goes like this. They say only this is now valid, because we only want the system insofar as it behaves according to P. So it's excluding all of this. Well, when you exclude this very knowable part, it's just Q. We know how to talk about it, but you're excluding, you're treating as if Q is the material basis. So you fake produce a material basis, right? Because you try to black box something that we could actually talk about, right? Similar with this, like you had a system and there were all these different ways of interacting, and you say, no, this ones you can no longer use. Even to name what you can't use, you need to be able to predicate it. So they were predicatable, right? So only P types of interaction are possible. Q types are now banned. So you make Q look like a knowable part of the environment. And the same thing with this kind of inquisitive approach, right? There are things in the environment that you actually know, like some affordances are P, some affordances are Q, and now you're saying, no, but only P are the ones we want. Q is not a proper answer. It's not a proper affordance. You're making it like you had the environment here, and you had the Q, and you're actually black boxing as if it's not meant to exist, right? So it does look like a weird inversion where in the political or emancipatory sense, we're going into the black box to try to come up with new names, new forms, right? And in the reactionary case, you are trying to kind of restrict this thing here into just a part of it. And forms that we already knew, you're trying to submit like black box old forms. So we can actually take this kind of, what you were saying then is that there is something, it's easier to describe why the organizational point of view is not accessible to the right, because the right is like creating even an additional layer of black boxing, of obscurity, right? This is why Badiou calls it the obscure subject. It's saying, well, I do know how to speak about all of these things, but I don't want to talk about this part. I don't want this part to exist. So it adds like an added veil on top of what was actually the material basis. So, for example, you start hating on immigrants, so immigrants cannot join. That's a mutilation. But now immigrants are covering over capitalist relations of exploitation. And it looks like immigration and exploitation is all the same. You can't tell those apart. So you further obscured the reality, right?
Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, I think the more we can make it like less about perspective, the better here, because from the reactionary standpoint, they could be saying, well, you know, for example, when you talk about reactionary movements against trans people, there is the operation they like to do is to perform a gender essentialism, or you know, it's all biological differences. That's what matters, and it's actually the left that is erasing biological differences. So you see, like, if it's from a perspective standpoint, they could say, ah, well, you're the one doing the mutilation. You're mutilating by taking out a biological difference and making it, you know, whatever, something that can be changed. Right? So the more we can avoid this perspective definition, the less this, you know, I mean, I think the better this theory will be for distinguishing these types of phenomena. But I mean, I agree with exactly what you're saying, that it actually has to do with the material basis and what can fall into that. Because I think with to talk about the gender essentialism or the biological differences between men and women and so on, that's, like you were saying, it's a false material basis, right? You're saying, ah, well, this difference is, we can't touch that, we cannot affect that, right? It's nature, it's built into the system in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also a really good thing, because it follows from what we're saying. If reactionary politics is about black boxing open boxes, right? And based on the predicates that it wants to preserve, it also means it's constantly, and our definition of nature is the global synthesis of all material bases of a social world. It follows that the right is constantly producing a new concept of nature, because it's trying to treat as black box a lot of things that are open boxes. So it's trying to include into what appears as nature a bunch of things that we can actually decompose and talk about and see how they work, right?
Exactly, yeah.
That's really cool. Like, that's a really good
it works.
conclusion.
Yeah, it works.
But again, I think you're right in saying that this allows us to kind of, we don't need to talk about, I mean, you can actually quantify, like, the organizational point of view. If all of this is a good approach, that means that the organizational point of view is a capacity that systems, then ecologies, then political movements can have, which is something that I think Rafael was aiming at when he criticized how I presented here, which is, this makes sense, this definition, which I lost where it is, this one. It makes sense that organizational point of view has something to do with treating your own system as a means to other systems, but there is a capacity of treating your system as means to other systems. That's something you can acquire by your composition and by how you interact and by what's intelligible. So you can embed this rather than define it as a point of view, right? So you could ask, what's the capacity of a certain political movement to think organizationally? Because it is conditioned on something. It's not a given that that point of view exists, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, just our own experiences in SDP and also in the common space of organizations, it does seem to be pointing at that constraint or that capacity. You know, like when we meet with another organization, we have some communication channels, that still leaves open the work of how do we, how do we work together, right? How do we formulate this relationship with these other groups? But it's not just the level of, I mean, I think communication is one layer of it. So two groups, usually in order to be an affordance for another group, you probably need to communicate with that group, right? In some way.
Yeah, you need to interact.
Interact on some level, yeah. But beyond that, there's also like mapping out the environment, the shared environment together.
Yeah, because like now that I think of it, the fact that this doesn't exist, this is there is no sexual relation. You can't at the same time see what things afford you and what you afford to others. Well, the only situation where these two things coincide is if there is a fusion between these two groups. Because then you can be in the position of the system. But if you are in the position of the system, you're no longer yourself, because you're now a different system. So there is like you cannot make this perspective shift, right? You can compose environments, for example. So for example, if you could say that these interactions here plus these systems here, they could be a shared environment, right? If this was a system S1 and this here is a system S2, you could talk about the shared environment that they have, right? And you can talk about the fact that they interact and they interact with other things. But if you occupy the point of view of system 1, it actually looks like this. And if you occupy the point of view of system 2, it actually looks like this. So none of them have actually this view, right? I mean, if they are part of like a larger system, maybe so. But there is something about being like seeing what these things afford you and being part of what they afford to others that are kind of disjunct. And it does take further composition to get to a point where this arrow starts becoming more concrete. But for this arrow to become more concrete, both this and this need to change, right? Which is another way of, I mean, if this is like love, like building something, and the idea is that love is conditioned on there not being sexual relation, right? The fact that this is not given is a condition for why you need to build this. So I think I was a bit nervous when Rafael caught this intuition that like, okay, but does this exist? Because I think that the consequence of my presentation is that there is no organizational point of view.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the important conclusion there.
So like, because there is no organizational point of view, you can let's say there is a gain to be had by coming up with, like you use the material basis of your organization to change it in a way that affects the other one, and they also use their material basis and this affects you, and you start building some type of new environment, a new ecology, and so on. Well, when you do that, you're starting to give this thing here more concreteness, right? Like you will never get this pure arrow, but you'll start getting, let's say, resources to understand that, for example, this part of your environment deals with this other part of your environment in this double sense of being an affordance for it and being a system for itself. And you will understand that this arrow is also therefore double in that way. So you start getting like concrete means to do this, but it's not a given, right? Like, I think that this is kind of what's underneath this idea we were discussing now, that I don't know where I added it, but yeah, I might have this thing here, right? That this thing is kind of going towards org, right? And if you don't want to postulate this pure thing here, you can just talk about some property of this new thing you're building and say that it has more or less of this org kind of quality. Well, it can parts of it can treat other parts of it in these two ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, perhaps there's no organizational point of view, but there is still the impetus to do this, right? I mean, there's a what to call it, yeah, shared work, solidarity. These are things, I mean, but and actually what we're saying here is that they are rife with phantasmatic. There's a phantasmatic dimension to this, which I think plays out a lot when you're talking about different leftist groups trying to unify and say that they are, you know, in the same tradition as this other group, or in the same, you know, we have solidarity with this movement here, but like it's totally abstract and totally has no material basis to it. I think
Yeah, I think
similar to the statement, there is no sexual relation. Because there's no sexual relation, there's also a vacuum where fantasy is.
Yeah, but I think that this is the point. Like, for example, what would be fantasy here? Fantasy would be the fact that, let's say, this is not just a system, right? This is a more complex thing that has to go into the MES stuff. It has a regulator to regulate its activities. It has a model of the environment, right? Part of this model includes a picture of how it is seen. For example, we think we are this militant here. We think that our organization is like the most revolutionary thing. We think that people are scared of how revolutionary we are. So we're going to add to this newspaper some things that calm people down. That's a fantasy. If we're just using our own model of the world to change our interactions with it, right? Or, for example, we think that we are very relevant for Palestine, but we have no contact with no Palestinians. Nothing goes in and out. We have no contact with organizations that are funding the genocide or whatever. We don't do anything. We release a small note of support to Palestine that just circulates amongst our friends. Like, that was based on our fantasy of solidarity, right? This kind of inner thing here, right? Well, if you're, for example, actually distributing the newspapers and you see people's reactions, like you expect the newspaper to convince people to join a meeting and they never join, and you start changing what's in the newspaper, no longer based on what you think about your organization, but as a kind of experiment. Let's see if we change it in this way, if it's interesting, if you have a reaction. You're no longer using your own mental model to guide what you do, your fantasy of what the other wants, right? You're trying things out and seeing how the other responds. And perhaps you're going to change it, or you just contact people and get them to, you change your organization to include people who come from this school where you're sharing your pamphlets, so that you become more relevant to them. You afford them something, like a place in your journal to talk about daily life in the school. That's not fantasy, right? You're substituting this kind of internal manner of filling the void of what the environment is, or what you are for the environment, right? With real things that you don't choose. They are the ones who choose what you afford them. That's actual solidarity, right? Or, for example, I want to help Gaza with amazing critique of the world order, but Palestinians want you to sabotage something. Well, that's something that you could afford them. It's not going to be what you want to be for others, right? So I don't think we need, I think we could just still distinguish, like, trying to bridge this gap based on the inner model you create of the environment, from trying to bridge this gap through, for example, the interactions with the environment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The only thing I'd add there is like once you have done the experiment, then you've also updated your model, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
It's the only way. Like, you have like an antinomy, right? Because of organizational Trinitarianism, this doesn't exist, right? Because the environment is warped by the composition. So because intelligibility is warped by composition, which is organizational Trinitarianism, these two things don't match, right? They don't match. The intelligibility of myself to another's composition is not the same as the intelligibility of others based on my composition. So these two things don't match. But because of organizational Trinitarianism, the only way to bridge this gap is to change the organization. So if now I create a different version of myself that interacts with the environment in a different way, then I can learn from it, vice versa, right? So if we change what we write and therefore change our relationship with the students, then I might be able to see things differently and get, so the fact, what you just said, that we update the model is the consequence of Trinitarianism, that if you want to overcome, like, you cannot, this is a very nice description of Lacan's whole thing. Like, it's not that you can't overcome the non-existence of sexual relation. Is that when you do, you're no longer yourself, right? So you can't have your identity, the other have their identity, and you just fuse them together. You can't. But you can change who you are, they change who they are, and you do a third thing that is neither of the two things, which is like a couple living their life. You're not like living your life and you don't know what the other wants, but to find that out, you also need to change yourself. So you can only learn by changing. So you never get both, the cake and eat the cake.
Yeah, I like this. So it's org is then less of a, I mean, what we previously called org, not this fantasy, but it's the impetus, right? The cause that causes the change to happen. It's the
I would say, like, the organizational point. This is what I'm trying to understand, like how to present this, because it looks like, because this is very obvious. Like, this is something we do all the time. It's not like a special thing. Like, this question of what do we put in this paper? So this is the question that we have. What do we put in the paper so that it affords something to others? That's an organizing question. We do that. We ask that question all the time, right? And the paper is really something that does allow, because it's an interaction that will change both us and change the other. It is a place where we can ask this question and see how it goes, right? So we do that all the time, and it is. But would you say, well, but these militants now, they unlocked the organizational point of view? No, because they only have that point of view insofar as they asking questions about the newspaper, right? You wouldn't call them organizers in general. You would call them, for example, student organizers, because they are asking that question concretely in the context of this other system. So, like, can you arrive at just being an organizer without anything counting as your environment that you're making this shift? I think that's what we're saying. It's potentially blocked, right? let's say you can only think organizationally in a political sense as much as you can build an environment and a type of system for which these questions have concrete answers. It can be very, very broad, like the Communist Party in the 30s, 40s. It was like this huge international thing. It was constantly asking like what it affords to local, like the Russian Communist Party, right? The Soviet Communist Party. It was constantly affording things to other parties around the world, helping like in the 50s with revolutions and so on. And it was also a system with its own strategy. Like it probably was the biggest organizational organ we had. Like when you are dealing with the issues that the Third International was dealing with, you were dealing with a very, very robust question about what does it mean to see things organizationally. But it still wasn't like the pure thing, right? It was still constrained by the composition of the Third International. So, for example, the fact that it was a majoritarily white male European international did pose problems. Like they did have problems like integrating questions that were being brought by Caribbean communist parties that were dealing with racism in ways that were not appearing in Europe and things like this. So they were limited. They couldn't make that shift for any issue, right? So you know, like there does seem to be the case that this question, like this approach, right? I think it does give a much more concrete kind of basis to start building what is the organizational point of view. And I do think that there's something about it that should be able to be defined at this level, very basic, small level. But it's slightly different from what we were doing before.
Yeah, but it's really productive. I think it connects the earlier work with this experimental. I mean, we always knew, right? We always kind of started from the idea that we needed a way to allow for experiments to have some kind of theoretical validity or something, you know, like some almost like making experiments into the first class notion in politics rather than your doctrines. So I think this accomplishes that, right? It says that the org POV is on the side of experiments, not on the side of your model of the world. So there's no one theory that's going to unlock the org point of view for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the next thing is just understanding how these, I mean, this whole process you just described of changing yourself for the organizations changing in a certain direction. That's the closest thing we have to org itself. Like org itself is not a place you stand on, but it's the movement, the real movement, right, that abolishes the present state. Basically.
Yeah, I'm trying to find here because I think that this is maybe we can just adapt we can adapt Bogdanov's original definition. He said for the glossary because he says just find here. This thing here, this is where I think this is the origin of this idea. When he says this, whatever the activeness, whether decomposing or combinative, being directed at a certain complex, it inevitably encounters there a resistance that may be high or low, right? So when one thing is interacting with another, there's always a resistance. This resistance is measured by the sum of effort, or generally by the total energy spent to overcome it. It provides us with the characteristics of the complexes themselves, as it depends on their composition, the elements they are built of, and on their structure, the relationship between these elements. For example, the resistance to our intervention offered by the organism of our animal or plant is determined by the characteristics of its organs and tissues, as well as by the relationships between them. The resistance of mental associations to cognitive analysis and synthesis is conditioned by the stuff of the underlying ideas, as well as the nature of associative combinations and so on. The notion of resistance is not something special and independent. It's just the same activeness, but viewed from a different point of view, one opposed to other activenesses. When two men are wrestling, the activeness of one man is the resistance to another and vice versa. In this sense, there are no principal differences in nature between living and non-living, conscious and spontaneous, blah, blah, blah. Every activity is a resistance to activities which it confronts. The elements of an organization or complex studied within the organizational framework are reduced to active resistances. Isn't this very much what we're saying here? Right? From this standpoint, we act and the environment resists. So this is action, this is resistance. From this standpoint, this is action and we are resisting. And he's saying that the organizational point of view is composed of this, considered as something which is interchangeable. Isn't it like this, right? We are acting, they are resisting. From the other point of view, we are the ones bothering, doing the resisting, and they're just acting, going to school. And he already had this insight. Somehow, the organizational framework is one that is saying that there is this equivalence at the basis. Acting is resisting, viewed from another point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Has that same shift of perspective.
Yeah. So what I think is what I think it's making this more complicated is because we can define this. Like, let's say we define this, and I think we could add this as that. What is an organization? We could add to the glossary. If you take a system as something which outputs things into the environment and gets inputs from the environment, we call an organization, which is pretty much what I wrote here, right? If you consider the systems as also being the set of affordances for another system, which is meaning inverting action and resistance, right? That is to adopt the organizational point of view, which is what he says here. This is to study things from the organizational framework, to just reduce them to these. So we could define this. Given a system in its environment, we define the organizational point of view on that system, the point of view that treats as that allows for the shift between considering the system and its environment, or the inverse, the system as being the environment for another system, something like that. The problem that we have, that Bogdanov didn't have, is that at this point in his work, he wasn't defining what allows you, like what composition allows you to see the world in that way, right? And we're saying that if you want to stick to politics and not science, you need to build an organization that has that capacity. It's not something that you can just shift that cognitively and then it's done, right? So
yeah, exactly. I think he defined a meta-political or scientific question.
Yeah,
which is this, like, in the scientific sense, yes, you can adopt this perspective and then see everything in terms of activeness and resistance pairs. But then now we're saying, okay, for actual political organizations, what needs to happen for this to really matter, right, politically?
Yeah, I'm gonna just add this quote so we have it here if we want later. And I mean, he goes much further than what we do, right? He wants such a broad kind of it's really only something a science could achieve in terms of broadness, right? I'm just gonna add this here. I also like the fact that this is a relativity theory. Right? This is the organizational point of view is a relativity principle for social organization.
Yeah, and Lenin kind of criticized this, right?
Yeah, he didn't like relative. He did, yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure if we are happy with that definition, but I wonder if we have a better way of defining this, but because it's funny, like organization, and even here, like what is an organization? And then we define the point of view, and we don't define what an organization is, right? And even Bogdanov, he doesn't define what an organization is. He defines the organizational framework, right? So perhaps this should be organizational point of view. I'm going to add a cryptic note here that I don't know how to justify, but it is crucial to note that given a certain system and its environment, there is no way to instantiate the organizational point of view, namely for that system to fully adopt the point of view of another and the warping of itself under that other system's compositional constraints. In a way, organizational point of view as a general perspective does not exist. However, one can define malleable capacity to occupy a restricted organizational point of view based on the ways social and especially political transformations allow a system to relate to structure as part of a larger ecology. Genes, affordances. There is a firm connection between the concrete existence of the organizational point of view and the concrete existence of a complex political movement. Something like this? Is it too obscure or does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, I think we are defining in a negative way, like the boundaries, the limitations of. I think this is why we're not like relativists, right? Because we are saying, yes, there is a relativity there, but it's actually bounded by material constraints, right? You can't just adopt any perspective whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
And because of that, that's why you need this you need to talk about material black boxes and things like that.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important thing, that the hard thing is to, I mean, I think this is the big problem, right? The hard thing is not to talk about all the stuff we're talking about, but to define under which conditions you can access these things, right? So, I mean, I think this could even be a useful door for us to think strategy in the future, because there is a trade-off. Like, for example, we can talk a lot, like, just think about this drawing, right? It is a very abstract description with no content, right? You can't use it for almost anything. It's just too abstract and vague. Like, this is as concrete of an organizational point of view we can have under such a simple composition as our own, is having like a very small set of people sharing an environment which is so kind of depurated and made into this formal thing, right? Like, I would say, like, we can actually explain why we need mathematics to discuss the organizational point of view, because it's almost like this, right? Like, if you have a bunch of political groups here, and in a certain sense, a lot of us come from different political groups, or even if you just think of us as different, and we have this shared environment, and we know that it's very heterogeneous because every political group is coming from a different place. Like, having something formal here, it is something that will be in everyone's environment because it's so kind of skeletal and without content that it can kind of survive being like a Rosetta Stone, right? Like, it's almost like, if we're this person here, but we need to put something here that is affordable to many different other political groups. And like, given the very different composition of each of these political groups, you reduce the number of things that are affordable to all of them, right? Formalism, insofar as it just sketches relations, is something that remains affordable in the sense that it can be preserved under the warping of everyone, right? So it is not really the biggest point of view that treats systems as affordances for others. It's the smallest point of view, right? If you're in a political world, meaning what really matters is people connecting in real social relations, that we can manage to connect on within STP through like little drawings, like that's the smallest thing that we can share on our different environments, right? It's not the biggest point of view. It's only the biggest point of view in our kind of heads. But organizationally speaking, practically speaking, is the smallest one, right? It's like formalism is like this little bit that is very hard to make it mean different things under different environments. You can warp mathematics through different languages and countries, and it looks very similar, right?
Yeah, I like this, especially because it fits the definition of a limit. So
there you go. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a really good way of talking about, very nerdy way of talking about this. Like in our group, science is limits, but with politics, we want co-limits. We want the big picture, right?
yeah, exactly.
Just gonna see if I need to add something here. I think there's I didn't add ecology yet. I'll add it later. Yeah, but guys, just having this conversation already helped me because I was really kind of, I think this is something I skimmed over in the presentation, but actually is like a huge thing, you know? I mean, I think I'm, maybe I can add this, even if we don't discuss it now. I think that we could have this distinction between like what I call non-sites, which perhaps can have a better name, which is black boxes that when you open them, they take you to something which is not a social world. Then relative sites, which are sites that take you to another layer in the world, right? So this doesn't exist for commodities, but it does exist for the law, right? Like you're making people work overtime beyond the existing law. We call a lawyer, he will open that black box and he will say, this is forced slavery. And he will punish people and he will oblige these people to work under the law and so on. That's a site. That was a black box that didn't exist for the commodity and we forced it into existence. But it was a site in one layer. It wasn't a site in every layer, right? Yeah, and then you can have like a strong transformation or absolute sites. I'm just adding this, then I can define this later. This thing here, I don't know how to call this. I think that this is a really interesting trade-off that I'm not sure if, like, it made sense to me, but I'm not sure if it makes sense for everyone. Like the difference between if everything is vertically integrated in an aligned way, if you find a site, you probably find a site in 3 layers. If things are not vertically integrated in an aligned way, they are misaligned. So for example, labor laws are separate from how commodity production is done, which are separate from other things in the communal level. When you find a layer that has a site, it might not be the site in the other layer. So for example, in Brazil, there's a lot of slave work going on. But we have the means to punish people who do that. It already exists. You just need to apply it. So you find a black box in one layer, but it's not a black box in another layer. You know? And then it looked like there is a nice trade-off, because in aligned spaces, you find like absolute sites more easily. But to build on them, you need to build against all layers at once, all the time. So the social pressure against propagating that novelty comes from everywhere all at once. So for example, you don't see communes these days in first world countries, because it's the state, capital, and culture will destroy and pressure against that automatically. It's much easier to resist the pressure of the world in peripheral countries where there are places the state forgot, places where you already don't have like capitalist economy functioning. But it's harder to find the absolute sites. So there's like a trade-off, you know?
Yeah,
But there
I
is
think this is one of the most original, unique aspects of this approach that I think we didn't really talk about this before, but it makes sense.
the issue is like there's green arrow here. It doesn't have a name, right? We never spoke about, let's say, this type of pressure, right? It's kind of like the environment's pressure, or the compulsion, right? I don't know how to name this trade-off, like transfer, like a site trade-off, right? Or like, how would we call this difference, you know?
Yeah, something like the resistance of the world to change, right?
But it's not just the
Social
resistance.
friction or something.
Yeah, social friction. That's a nice idea. Like there's perhaps there's like a friction trade-off, like between finding absolute versus relative sites and finding more versus less pressure, more versus less friction, right?
Mhm.
I'll add it like that just so we can.
Okay, yeah, I need to go.
Yeah, I need to go too.
If you guys continue, I'll catch the recording.
But I just change the name of this to make it less complex. I need to go too, but Monica, how should I do this? I'll just take the ones that I did and I'll add the links. And then should I upload the folder to that same folder for you to download if you want?
Yeah, perhaps that will be the best way.
Yeah, I was trying to upload it here. See, I added a glossary here, and it's uploading to the cloud. It's the same, everything we were talking about, but now it has the things we just added now. See? Like aligned forms, social environment.
Yes.
So I will try to share with you the link to this folder, and then you need to open this. You will see it on this part here of your desktop.
Okay.
And then if you link this as a vault, we should have the same folder. And when I update, yours updates, and vice versa. So I'll try to send you this soon. But thank you so much, Monica. This was amazing. Like you just did something that I think is going to be so helpful. I mean, it already was, just by talking to you guys today. It was already really
that's
nice.
great.
Thank you so much. Okay. See
Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye-bye.